Hi guys, my name is Alicia, and if you don't know who I am, I make thrifting videos every single week, and today we're actually going to be doing a little bit of a thrift flip. So a couple of weeks ago now, I actually picked up this quilt from the thrift store, fully intending on making a quilt jacket, which has been like a huge trend for like the past year basically, but I really knew I wanted to make one when Teddy Fresh came out with their version of it. It's like this really cool quilted chore jacket, and of course Teddy Fresh is like my inspo for so many of my thrift flips. So today we are going to be transforming this quilt into a quilted jacket. And yeah, I know this has been like done before a million times at this point. Now it's my turn, and I'm really hoping it's gonna turn out, because not gonna lie, I've been like staring at this blanket in my room for the past couple weeks, and the more that I look at it, the more I'm like, do I even like these colors? Like, do I even like this pattern anymore? I think once it's a jacket, it's gonna look really cool. And I'm super excited because this is actually the first sewing project I'm doing where I'm using like an actual pattern. The pattern I'm gonna be using is actually completely free. It is from Peppermint, and it's the Peppermint West End jacket. So I picked this jacket because it was kind of like closest match to the Teddy Fresh chore jacket. I've basically got my patterns all printed out ready to go, but now that that's out of the way, we can get to the fun part, which is actually sewing. So actually no, we can't get to sewing just yet because we still have to cut out all of our fabric pieces. So I started by folding the blanket in half and placing all of the pattern pieces in areas that I thought it would look best. Some of them on the fold as required. Then I pinned them down and cut each piece out. Okay, so we are finally ready to start actually sewing this jacket. Putting together the patterns and cutting out the fabric took so much longer than I was anticipating. So needless to say, I'm very excited to actually start putting this thing together. So I've just got the instructions pulled up on here, and technically the first step is going to be putting together the back piece of the bodice with the back yoke. So this is honestly really nice, following like exact instructions and like knowing that, you know, everything's gonna line up because everything was measured properly. So I'm very excited for that because I feel like it's a lot less stressful than when I usually make things. So it's starting by saying to put the two bad sides together, which is kind of like different from what I normally do, which is putting the good sides together. And the reason we're actually putting the bad sides together is because we're actually going to be doing a flat felled seam, which I have actually never done before, but I did look up a tutorial and I'm feeling pretty confident. I think I kind of have the idea of what I have to do. So I'm gonna go ahead and pin these pieces together, and we're gonna sew our first line. Alright, so our first two pieces are together. As you can see, we've got the nasty raw edge on the good sides, which is the whole point of the flat felt seam, because we're basically gonna like fold this over so it's like nice and clean. Kind of like a seam on a jean. I feel like that's the most common flat felt seam, I think. I don't know, this is my first time doing it. So essentially the next step it says to do is we're going to actually be trimming this bottom seam allowance and then folding the top one over so it's like nice and clean. First thing we need to do for the flat felled seam is to trim one side of the seam allowance. We're going to grab our fabric scissors and dust off our hairs from trimming our bangs the night before. And now we can start trimming it down, being very careful as to not cut through any other parts of the fabric. Now comes the tricky part. We need to take that remaining seam allowance and fold it over the trimmed seam allowance, making sure no raw edges are showing, and then pin it in place. Once our entire seam is pinned down, we can simply just top stitch it in place. My first flat felled seam is done. Not gonna lie, it's definitely not perfect. I think my problem was I wasn't being generous enough with my seam allowance, so there wasn't quite enough fabric to complete the fold, so it's kind of already starting to fray in certain places, which is not good, but I don't really feel like redoing it, so we're just gonna move on and take that as a lesson for the next pieces. So this is the back of the jacket, and the next step is to actually attach the two front pieces of the jacket. So back piece, front piece, we're basically going to attach them together there. So once again with that flat felled seam. So now that I have a little bit of practice, hopefully this will go a little bit better. So like I said, we're placing our front bodice pieces onto the back of the bodice, wrong sides together, sewing down the sides, and then repeating the whole flat felled seam process. Now that the sides of our bodices are attached, we can sew the shoulder seams. Same process, sew the wrong sides together, flat felled seams, you know the drill by now. The bodice is really coming together now. It's basically a vest, My flat felt seams have definitely been getting better with all the practice, so that's great. So I kind of want to just like try it on right now to see how it looks in its vest form. Okay, it obviously has a long way to go, but I feel like the fit of it, especially on the shoulders, is feeling pretty good. But this is pretty exciting. Like, it's getting closer to actually looking like a jacket now. So the next step actually is to do the collar. So we just have to put the collar together, right sides together. So we got the top and bottom collar here, and we're basically just going to be stitching the two pieces together and then eventually adding it to the jacket. So let's do it. For the collar, you may or may not notice that it's actually shaped differently than the one from the pattern. I personally didn't love the rounded collar, especially for this style of jacket, so I decided to go with a more classic pointed style instead. This was super easy. I basically just traced over the existing pattern with one of my jacket collars, and that ended up working out perfectly well. I basically just sewed along all the edges except for the bottom one. Then I flipped it inside out and gave it another round on the sewing machine for a top stitch. Once the collar's done, we can pin it to the top of the jacket and run that through the machine. Once that's attached, the next step is to actually start pressing the seams for the placket, which, if you don't know what the placket is, it's basically where the buttons and the buttonholes are going to go. Starting by folding the fabric 1 centimeter over and then again where indicated. I tend to usually try to avoid ironing, but trust me, you do not want to skip out on this step because it's going to make everything else so much easier. After that, you're going to just flip the jacket over, and this next step was extremely confusing, so I'm glad you guys are going to have a video demonstration because my brain was seriously hurting after doing this. But essentially, you're going to flip the placket over the opposite way that you just ironed and pin that in place so that we can sew. This is definitely a trust the process moment because you'll see how it's going to turn out in a little bit. Next, you're going to need some bias tape. Luckily, my blanket actually already came with some that was around the trim, so I just used that. We're basically going to use this to cover the raw edges on the collar. So we're going to start by pinning one edge of the bias tape to the collar, good sides together, and sew that down. Now we can flip the bias tape over the raw hem and top stitch that in place. Remember when I said to trust the process? Well, this is the moment of truth because we can now flip the placket right sides out, and now we have this nice clean edge, which I don't know why in my brain I didn't realize that this was why we were doing this, but it looks really good. Okay, so I feel like we're really getting somewhere with this jacket. The collar is like perfectly installed, and I feel like that was the hardest part, so I'm glad it's out of the way. I kind of feel like I can see the finish line in sight because all we have left to do is kind of hem the jacket, sew down the plackets, add the arms, add the buttons, and add the pockets because I actually saved that for last. But I mean, like, it's still quite a bit, but I feel like everything else is pretty straightforward. So next step, I believe, is to hem the jacket. So let's go ahead and do that. Hemming the jacket was actually really similar to the placket, folding 1 centimeter over and then again where indicated. Then we're gonna fold the opposite way like we did with the placket, sewing it down and then flipping it right sides out to create once again that nice clean edge. Then it was just a matter of sewing the plackets and the hem in place with the top stitch on either side. Okay guys, so I'm super excited because for one, I finally invested in some studio lights, which I should have done so long ago, but I'm glad I finally did because now the lighting looks good all the time. It does not matter how sunny it is outside. And two, we are finally at the sleeve portion of the jacket, which I'm especially excited for because it's the final like pattern pieces to add on, and once that's done, it's just like the little details, I guess. So first step is basically just going to be pinning the sleeves together like this and sewing them so that they're basically a tube. Pretty straightforward. I sewed the two right sides together to create a tube, had to give it a little test drive, and then just finished it off with a zigzag stitch since this is actually the only raw edges we're gonna see throughout this entire jacket, so we want to make sure those aren't gonna start unraveling. Next up, cuffs. I prepped those by folding them in half, hot dog wise, and then folding one edge down by 1 centimeter. Now we're going to fold it the opposite way, hamburger wise, right sides together, and sew that in place. Now we can attach our cuffs to our arms, sew them in place, and flip them right sides out. Then all we have to do is just a simple top stitch on the top and the bottom of the cuffs to finish them off. Now that we've got our arms all assembled, we can actually attach them to the jacket. At this point, there was an option to opt out of the flat felled seam and just go for a simple stitch. Not gonna lie, this was extremely tempting, but I figured we made it this far, we might as well do one more flat felled seam. So I started with the jacket right sides out, and we're going to take our sleeve and slide it inside the jacket with the wrong sides together and pin it in place. Once we run that through the machine, we can flip that arm right side out, where we can see those familiar raw edges waiting for their flat felled seam. This flat felled seam was definitely the most challenging since it was more of like a circular shape, so do be warned for that. Alright, so we are so close to finally finishing this jacket. The main part of the jacket is pretty much done. We just have to do the finishing touches. But lastly, all we have to do is the pockets and the buttons. So for the pockets, I was originally gonna go more down the route of like the Teddy Fresh style pockets where it's got like the little flap, but I've kind of decided not to do that because for one, those pockets are just not going to be functional for me. Like I much prefer pockets down here than to have to like undo a button and put something up here. Like it's not as practical. And two, the pockets that come with the pattern are just so much easier, and at this point I just really want to get this jacket finished. So we are going to stick to the original pattern for the pockets. Okay, we're going to speed run this next part because for one, I'm trying to wrap up this video, and for two, the pocket was pretty simple. So we're going to start by pressing 1 centimeter down on the top of the pocket, flip it, and press the opposite way. Pin that in place and then sew each side down. Next, flip that piece right side out and press the left, right, and bottom edges. Then just finish it off with 2 top stitches. Now all you gotta do is place this finished pocket onto your jacket and top stitch it in place. Lastly, we have the buttons. If you've never sewn a buttonhole before, in my opinion, it's actually really simple, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. So you want to start by setting your stitch width all the way to 6 and the stitch length almost to 0, but like not quite. Then, if your machine is anything like mine, you'll see 3 different options for the buttonhole, and we want to start with number 1. We can then start sewing with number 1, which is essentially going to be the bottom of the buttonhole. Next, switch that into gear number 2 and sew down the left side of the button. Repeating the process with number 3, and then lastly, number 4. As you can see, we got our nice little buttonhole, which now needs an actual hole. So we're going to take our seam ripper and carefully start creating a hole without actually cutting through the stitches we just made. And your buttonhole should be complete. I usually do this just by eye, but the key here is to make the buttonhole as small as possible so that the button can still squeeze through, but won't be able to come out easily. And finally, all we have to do is sew on our buttons. Alright, so here is the finished jacket. I think it actually ended up turning out pretty good. You know, a lot of like the seams and everything aren't perfect, but it actually kind of looks like the jacket from the pattern, so I think that's a win. I am really glad I went with these pockets, like I'm already putting them to use. And I'm glad that I did change up the pattern to have the more traditional, just like triangle kind of collar. It just looks like more like a traditional chore jacket. This is what the back looks like. I just paired it with my blue Converse because I feel like the blue matches really well with the colors of the jacket. And about the colors of the jacket, maybe it's just because I've been staring at this print for way too long, but I don't want to say I'm not sure if I like it, but I don't know. I feel like I'm just sick of looking at this pattern in these colors, so I feel like I need to like hide this away in my closet for a bit, kind of forget what it looks like and pull it out again to like re-fall in love with it, because I don't know, the more I'm wearing it, it kind of is growing on me, but let me know what you guys think. Did I choose like good colors even for this jacket? But overall, I'm happy with it. I'm very impressed with myself that I actually followed through with everything. Like there was a couple times where I was like, wanted to kind of take an easy way out, but I was like, no, let's stick to the pattern, and I think it paid off. I'll do up the buttons for you guys. I probably won't wear it buttoned up as often, but the amount of time it took me to make these buttonholes and sew these buttons on, I should be using it. So that's what it looks like buttoned up. I feel like I did a pretty good job of like choosing where to cut out the pattern, because I like how the diamond pattern kind of like continues this way, even though they're like 2 different colors. I think it's pretty cool. One arm might be slightly shorter than the other, but let's just ignore that. But overall, although this project took me so many hours, I don't even want to talk about it. I am really glad that I took on this project because I feel like I learned so much, and like every sewing project I do, I feel a little bit more confident with sewing, and I learn new skills that I can use for my next project. Like now I know how to do the flat felt seam, and it's actually really not that hard at all. So, but as always, I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. I do plan on making a lot more sewing content this year, so this was a good project to start off the year, but maybe I'll do some simpler ones next. Please let me know what you think of it. Like, do you like the style? Do you like the print I chose? And I will see you next week.